Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL Spring Split Week number 2 overview and analysis video. First off, apologies for this video coming out a bit late. It's coming out at the end of Tuesday. That means there's already been 2 full days of week number 3 played in the LPL. I know this is coming out a lot later than I want. I usually try to get these videos out on Monday, but I'll explain in just a second why that was a bit more difficult over the course of this week. I just want to thank you for your patience at the start. Does mean that the schedule's getting rearranged a bit. It's going to be a double upload tomorrow with the NACL and the LCK. Hope you guys are excited for that, but we are getting this LPL video out as early as we possibly can. So again, thank you so much for understanding and, being a little bit patient on this, but one of the reasons that this video is coming out very late, and the reason it's coming out at the end of Tuesday, is I was on the LPL English broadcast as a color commentator for the 2 series that happened earlier today, or over the night, as I'm recording this, Tuesday morning, I guess, technically. And if you're interested in that, go check out the VOD. I'm going to link, obviously, the channel, both the Twitch and the YouTube, down in the description below. Not only that, but as you can see up on the screen, I will be casting again on the 20th, Easter morning, Sunday here in the United States with Mazel. I will be casting the Ultra Prime versus LNG series, and so if you're interested in, kind of watching me cast the LPL live, definitely go check that out on the LPL English channel, either the Twitch or the YouTube. Again, both of those are going to be linked down in the description, and if you want to know my thoughts on where I think a lot of these teams are, just see me commentate 2 series in a row earlier today, and, just get my thoughts on live reactions to the LPL, check out the VOD of that, but that's a big reason why this is coming out a little bit later. That being said, I still have a lot to talk about when it comes to the LPL, so I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning of this video. Let's go ahead and jump into the actual content, shall we? If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be updating my personal power rankings, and I'll try my best not to let the first couple series of week 3 influence those power rankings. Of course, there are some takeaways there, but I'll save that for next week's video, which hopefully will be coming out on time. So again, thank you for that, but without further ado, it's a lot of intro. Usually I try not to keep these intros too long, but let's go ahead and jump into our first series. So many series to cover. We are really back into the thick of things when it comes to the LPL, the 16 to 18 best of 3s a week that we get to cover. And the first one that we got is a Group Nirvana matchup. Finally here to start off. Of course, they play so many less games, but it is a matchup between LGD Esports and Edward Gaming, 2 organizations that have pretty consistently been good at the LPL level throughout their entire tenure, that have not really showcased that over the course of this year, and Edward Gaming is going to be able to come out on top. They're going to pick up the series 2-1 here. This is expected. LNG, as you can see in my power rankings, is last in the LPL right now, but they are making some changes to the roster to try and salvage their season. Remember, single round robin in Group Nirvana. Bottom 2 teams are not just done for spring, they're done for summer as well. And so if there's ever going to be a time for you to make these gigantic changes and try to swing things in your favor, it's now. And that's what LNG is doing. Weibo and Fodic are benched officially for LNG. 5T5 is coming into the jungle, and LP is returning to LNG as their AD carry, playing with Juo now. I'll kind of get to that team in a little bit, because I do think these are the right changes to make. Like, Weibo needed to be benched. I think he was holding this team back. I think Fodic is obviously one of the weaker AD carries in the entire league. I've been saying that for years, even when he was getting hype, and so, I'm for these changes. I just don't know if they have the personnel right now to be able to upgrade in those spots, at least consistently, but Edward Gaming is a good team for Group Nirvana standards. This is very easily a team you could make an argument is the most talented in Group Nirvana. Not sure I would make that argument. There are a couple teams that I think have played better over the course of 2025, but a lot going for them here. And even though they end up losing game number 2, they're definitely the better team in this series, and it wasn't really particularly close, especially in that deciding game number 3. Player of the series really came down to 3 players, and it kind of just depends on what you value the most. I thought ZDZ was really excellent on the Rumble in game number 1. Super important that he is, playable at a baseline level, because he just has not been really at any point so far in 2025. His career started okay on Anyone's Legend, but it's continuously gotten worse and worse as the top lane talent pool has gotten better and better. He was better than Zika in this series, and that's huge for Edward Gaming. Now, I'm not blaming Zika entirely on the other side of this matchup. Again, very little that he's going to be able to do in terms of salvaging LNG season. We've talked about that a ton, but ZDZ just being not a negative for Edward Gaming is absolutely ginormous for their future outlook. He is probably the biggest reason why this team is sitting in Group Nirvana in the first place. He's been a bottom 2, bottom 3 top laner in the LPL so far in 2025. But the other two players, Xiaohao, Wink, it's basically got to go to one of those two in terms of how they played in Game 3. Xiaohao was definitely the carry threat on the Viego, ends up with like 10 kills in that game number 3, but a lot of it was created by, I would say, others on this team, ZDZ on the Poppy, and more notably for me, Wink on the Gragas, who is going to get that player of the series. Wink has not been perfect. I really had high expectations for On and Wink coming back together as a duo, and they've been okay, but they've certainly not been great. On has definitely taken his time getting used to playing at this level again, which is frustrating because he probably should have been on this team from the start of the year and just kind of given the reins to go. It felt very weird for him to be dropped at the start of the year in the first place, and so nice to see him back, but it does feel like he's finally starting to pick up that slack, and Wink feels way more comfortable. The Gragas was actually tremendous in this game number 3. The creation was ginormous. We're not seeing a ton of support Gragas globally, and I'm really excited to see if that ends up picking up because I do think it's a pretty nice counter to a lot of these more aggressive poke-oriented lanes. Like the Ezreal Karma didn't really have an easy answer here, not to say that LP and Juo are on the same level as On and Wink, just kind of worth noting in that regard. But the best way I can really describe this series overall for EDG is they were just kind of better across the board. LNG don't have any firepower going for them right now. Like, Zeke is a good player, and we'll talk about Haichao, who played probably his best series as a member of LNG here because he was at least kind of relevant, and he has been atrocious for LNG throughout this split and throughout this year, but EDG still was relevant and better in basically every area. You know, LNG struggles to be able to generate pressure, and EDG took advantage of that. But like I said, for LNG, they're making some roster changes. 5T5 coming in for Weiwei, LP coming in for Fodic. We'll talk about LP first because he's the player that more people are going to be familiar with. This is obviously a player that's had success at this level before. He's played for a good LNG team previously before they were able to acquire Gala, but I've never been a fan of LP. I always thought he was pretty overrated and overhyped just considering the team that he got to start his career on. It felt like his job was incredibly easy, and we kind of saw the problems with what LP was as a player when he did transition to being the AD carry for RNG after Gala left, and he just could not fill those shoes. He was such a significant downgrade that that team couldn't even be remotely like competitive throughout a lot of that. Now, is he better than Fodic? Maybe. Like, I think it's pretty fair to say that he is. He's certainly going to be less feast or famine than Fodic. I think he's going to fit within the confines of this team a little bit better if you're not trying to just win or lose through bot lane, but I don't think he has the mechanical ceiling that Fodic has, even if Fodic's floor is way lower. I think it just increases or decreases the variance, but again, decreases your ceiling as well, which I'm not sure is the right move. Weiwei being benched here, I think, is necessary, though. I've talked about it a lot over the course of this year. Weiwei is just not a good jungler when he doesn't have his laners completely playing for him. We saw it after he left Weibo last year when Scout was unwilling to sacrifice everything to just make Weiwei's life a little bit easier, and their duo was just horrendous for a majority of the year until Weiwei just said, screw it, I'm going to pick Sejuani and Maokai every game and just not play my own style and let Scout actually win us games. Ended up really working out in that regard, but it's not working out here. Again, like the carry-oriented junglers, he just doesn't have the skill level around him on the team as well as in himself to be able to actually generate that pressure. So 5T5 coming in, a rookie jungler here in the LNG system. Not a great debut. He's going to get out of the series mostly for that Pantheon game in game number 3. Gigantic jungle gap between him and Xiaohao. You guys know I love Xiaohao. I'm certainly not going to begrudge a player, joining the LPL and immediately having to go up against him, but certainly a lot to fix here. Zika is still hard stuck. Haichao actually played totally fine in this series. Maybe you wanted him to be a bit more aggressive, but he has been actively bleeding resources in the mid lane. That didn't happen in this series. Angel has certainly not been tremendous in 2025, but this is still a decent sign. But LP and Juo are going to have to be better. 5T5 is going to have to come in and do something. Like, these are desperate changes for a desperate org that's just trying their absolute best to not be bottom 2 in Group Nirvana. Unfortunately, they are on pace to do that right now. But for Edward Gaming, it's a nice win. You're probably not a bottom 2 team here. You're probably a top 2 team. This is a team that very well could make a play-in series, a best of 5. And I don't know, like, could they make playoffs? I think it's realistic. I think it's definitely possible if they continue to level up. They still have weaknesses, but they're able to hide them, and I think that they will continue to be able to do that, especially against Nirvana talent. Then moving on to our second series of day number 1 here, and we get to go up to Group Ascend, and we get to see our defending champion, Top Esports, taking on Weibo Gaming, and Top Esports is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. They look like the better team by, again, a pretty considerable margin in this matchup. There is a pretty big jungle gap in that game number 3 in terms of the pressure and tempo that's able to be generated by Top Esports, and I know that there have been a lot of conversations about whether or not TES should have kept Tion, whether they should have, ran it back with that, version of the roster, tried their best to keep Mako and just, tried to see what they could be in 2025, but Kanavi has come in and, in my opinion, is dominating the MVP conversation right now. I think a lot of people might disagree with that just because of the feelings that they have about his international performances, but domestically, he's been the best player in the LPL so far in the spring split. For Weibo Gaming, Their middle of the map just completely let them down in this series. Tian and Xiaohu got completely outplayed for Weibo. Again, we'll talk about that a bit more. There were other things that went wrong. I'm certainly not going to blame it entirely on two players, but it becomes a lot more difficult to win in this current meta on this current map if the middle of your map is so bad. And unfortunately for Weibo, that just kind of was the case in this series. But we start with Top Esports as per normal. We start with our winners, two good options for player of the series, but really at the end of the day, this is Kanavi's to take home. As the facilitator, sometimes he can go a bit under the radar. I talk about it a lot. You need to be good at things like Sejuani and Vi in order to be a successful jungler at the top level. If you are not one of the best Sejuani players in the world, it's hard for me to consider you a top 3 or 5 jungler, if only because you have to play that champion. Like, you have to be able to play for your lanes. It's great and all to be able to play carries, and I think it's harder to play carries. I'm certainly not trying to say, oh, if you only play Naafiri and Lilia, you're bad at the game. I'm just saying you kind of have to do both in terms of being able to function at a high level, and Kanavi is a great facilitator. Look at that Sejuani game in Game 3, man. Like, it was just everything you could want out of a Sejuani jungle. Completely out-jungled Tian in terms of the tempo and pressure he was able to get in the mid-game. It's like an absolute masterclass with what you would want to see out of that player. Obviously, you still have to enable your laners. They still have to be able to step up and do damage, but you have plenty of talent on this team, more than enough talent to be able to capitalize on that. So credit to Kanavi coming in, facing the former jungler of Top Esports and, you know, completely jungle canyoning him, quite frankly, in this series. But JackeyLove was, of course, the other player that a lot of people are going to consider. The Draven was really good in game number 3. I'm certainly not going to take anything away from him. He was the player that they were, you know, facilitating and pushing forward. You can already see that in terms of how their draft ended up working out, but it's really the Kai'Sa game in game number 1 that deserves a major shout out. JackeyLove has been so good domestically. There are real concerns about whether or not, you know, his international performances can get better because of the ways that they've been losing, because they've been punished so much for their aggression in the early game, both JackeyLove and Crisp, and, you know, JackeyLove in every lane that he's played for. But, you know, domestically speaking, and from a pure mechanical perspective, JackeyLove will always have an argument to be the number 1 AD carry in the world, and I think he is the best version of himself right now in comparison to what he's been in previous years, just because, again, he's kind of reined in those crazy, you know, suicide-oriented plays. He's a lot more controlled in terms of the chaos now, and I think it's worked out for him. Crisp was really good here. Creeman 369 in particular was really solid, and he just needs to get a lot more consistent. I get that the meme is he either rolls a 3 or a 9, but maybe we need to see a bit more of the, like, 6s in the middle, just because it's starting to get a bit laughable just how different the good and bad performances are. But at the end of the day, Top Esports, until proven otherwise, is the best team in the LPL, and this is just another feather in their cap in that regard. And for Weibo on the other side, they're really trying to play through Tian. The problem is when the middle of your map hemorrhages resources in the way that they did in this series, it's just so difficult. Xiaohu definitely deserves dud of the series for that Rise game alone in game number 1, but he certainly wasn't bad enough on Talia and Orianna for me to consider it. I'm giving dud of the series to Tian. Not only did he lose on Naafiri, which feels like it should be a crime in the current meta, I get that Vi has kind of been considered one of the answers to it, and certainly, you know, something that people want to opt into, but it's Tian on Naafiri. You have to hope that he's going to be able to carry that game, but he got completely jungle canyoned in game number 3 on the Xin Zhao. It's just unacceptable. He needs to play better than this, and he wasn't better than this in this series. But like I said, Xiaohu, like, that Rise game was the worst game of the series. He was 0-8, and it was like a noticeable 0-8. It wasn't just, oh, he ended up with a bad KDA at the end of the game. It's like, don't ever play Rise again if you're Xiaohu, because clearly this team is not set up to play around it. The rest of the team was, I guess, generally fine. Light and Hong were definitely not the better bot lane here, but I don't think they were the biggest problem. Breathe got gapped by 369, and this is the problem with Breathe. It's why I have a hard time considering him one of the best top laners in the LPL, because he just can't really go up against the best guys like 369 consistently, but all of that could have been salvageable if Tian and Xiaohu were just even remotely playable in this series, which they were just not. Like, the middle of the map got completely run over. But for Weibo, I still think they can be an okay team. They're just so inconsistent, it's really hard to get a good read of where they're at. And for Top Esports, obviously this is another great win, but Kanavi is really kind of proving himself to be everything we wanted him to be. I said at the beginning of the year, it's a really good bet for Kanavi to be an MVP frontrunner, an MVP candidate throughout this year. I think he is very much living up to that promise right now. But then moving on now to day number 2 here in week 2 of the LPL, and we get to stick with Top Esports. We're not quite done with them yet, as they take on FunPlus Phoenix to kick off day number 2, and if we thought that first series against Weibo was dominant, this was exceptional coming in from TES. Really nothing to criticize at all for them. This might even be a pretty quick segment considering we did just talk about this team, but a 23-minute win, a 28-minute win, neither game looking even playable. For FPX, we knew they were going to struggle in Group Ascend, but this is kind of a different level of domination, and once once again, I'm going to kind of push that same narrative over and over again. If Kanavi is not your gigantic runaway frontrunner for MVP in the LPL right now, I just don't really know what you're doing. There is nobody who has been on this guy's level so far in the Spring Split or Split 2 or whatever you want to talk about. He has gapped every player that he has gone into, and he continues to really push this team forward. FPX has some things going for them. I liked them coming out of the placement stage. I thought that they were one of the more interesting teams that is outside of that top 7 that we talked about. Thunder Talk and FPX, I think, are relatively close in terms of skill level, but when top esports is clicking, it's just doomed. Like, they're not talented enough to be able to go up against that version of TES. So we can talk about it here. Kanavi is, of course, going to get player of the series once again here. He dominated on the Pantheon in game number 1. He dominated on the Nidalee in game number 2. Like, we just saw the Sejuani and the Vi really pop off in that previous series, kind of showing that he can be that facilitative option. But don't forget, Kanavi made his name as a Nidalee player for a long time. The Pantheon is certainly not out of the realm. A possibility for him as well, as we saw in that game number 1. It's not just, oh, he's good at Sejuani, you know, he's going to be really consistent in that vein. There are junglers who can do that are solid, player like Beishuan, but the reason Kanavi is so dangerous is because it doesn't really matter what he picks. He's going to have a gold lead going into 10 minutes, no matter what. Like, it actually is just so predictable when it comes to him as a player. And he did it once again here. Shadow, maybe not the most consistent player in the world for FPX, certainly has had some pop-off moments, but not really been all that impressive on this team so far, in my opinion, considering what his track record was coming into this split. Kanavi just made him look like an absolute chump, quite frankly, in this series. A gigantic jungle gap, once again, I would say even bigger than what Kanavi had over Tion in the previous series, as you would expect in terms of the talent level here. But what else is there to say about Kanavi? This guy is just unreal. He is the best player in the LPL at the current moment, and I don't even know if it's all that close. Like, I love Tarzan, and I will push that Tarzan might be the most valuable jungler in the world, but in terms of raw production, Kanavi is the most productive player in the LPL right now, and I don't even think it's a conversation. I do want to point out Cream and 369, the solo laners here. I think both were able to generate pretty big leads on their own. Sheer is the star of FPX at the current moment. He's the reason they're in Group Ascend, and 369 had a pretty easy time being able to go up into him. You know, we saw last year that Sheer actually, you know, matches up decently well into 369. We saw that in the JDG Top Esports series from 2024, but 369 definitely had some revenge on his mind. Cream was also really good, and he continues to just be super consistent for this team. I probably don't say his name enough, but I really am still a gigantic fan of Cream in the mid lane. I think he's a top 2, maybe top 3, if you really want to, you know, give him some crap mid laner in the LPL at the current moment. The consistency is just excellent from him. Crisp and Jackie Love were really nice, even if they weren't the main characters like they quite were in the previous series, but Top Esports is just dominant. They can win through anywhere, and especially domestically, they really have no concrete flaws to be able to take advantage of. But for FunPlus Phoenix on the other side, they just don't have the firepower to keep up. They just don't have the talent to be able to go toe-to-toe with Top Esports here. Shadow was a very easy choice for dead of the series, got completely out-jungled, but it wasn't just Shadow that played poorly. I thought Jue really was overextending, really looking for some miracle plays down the stretch there. He is a dynamic playmaker, and I've hyped him up quite a bit on this channel, but this was not his series. Assume couldn't do anything in the bot lane. I still think he's getting a little bit overhyped. You know, I think people are looking at him coming into FPX, them immediately making Group Ascend, and kind of considering him this gigantic upgrade. I think it's more nuanced than that. I think Sheer has really kind of taken that step up, and I think a full split of Shadow over Sorrow has been a marginal improvement, you know, even if it's very small, but KR continuing to get outplayed. He is not good enough to be a Group Ascend mid laner. You know, Sheer is a good player, but 369 feels like he's on right now. There's just not really a lot of positives to take away from this for FunPlus Phoenix, and unfortunately, this is kind of what we expected. They're going to be one of the weaker teams in Group Ascend. WE is expected certainly to be the weakest. I think there's not a lot of debate in that regard, but to pretend like FPX was expected to be able to take a game off of Top Esports, I think would be lying and a little bit ridiculous. This is exactly how this series should have gone, and Kanavi, Cream, 369 in particular, they're really living up to the hype. Crisp also played really well here. It was just kind of Jackie Love that took more of a background role, but considering how he played against Weibo, that's totally fine. Top Esports is just so good, so complete across the board, and Kanavi really does feel like a player who is determined to not only win MVP, but dominate this split as revenge, essentially, for how he played at First Stand. Then moving on to our second series of day number 2 here, and it was Invictus Gaming taking on Anyone's Legend. Both teams really trying to solidify themselves after some ups and downs so far this year, and it's Anyone's Legend who is going to get the better of this series in a 2-0 win. Game number 2, and even game number 1 to an extent, like they weren't the biggest dominating victories. Maybe I'm just a little bit clouded because I'm coming off of those 2 Top Esports wins where they were a lot more dominant, but, you know, IG put up a little bit of a fight in this series. There are definitely some takeaways, especially from Jeja and Gala, that I think are positive to talk about, but AL was the better team, and there were real concerns with IG in terms of some of these players just not having any sense of consistency. Rookie has not been good in 2025. Mako has not been good in 2025, and these are big concerns for IG that might keep them out of that upper echelon, but AL just do not have those problems. Like, they are such a complete team, and they play off of each other so well. You know, we talked about Flandra and Tarzan kind of being the main characters on the top side, Hope kind of getting into that conversation as well, but that doesn't mean that Shanks and Kale are, like, down on the rungs of the ladder for me. They still are elite players, and they showcase that here, and, you know, I'm going as far as saying Kale was player of the series. I know Hope ended up really popping off on the Kai'Sa in game number 2, but I think the support gap in this series was absolutely ginormous. That Poppy game in game number 1, brilliant stuff from him. Like, easily the best game of the series, in my opinion, in terms of just raw execution. And it's not like the rel was significantly worse. Kai'Sa needed setup in that second game. There was a way for them to be able to lose that if the Kai'Sa didn't have not only active peel, but really nice setup to be able to start taking over and dive the backline of these fights. And Kale, I think, really did a great job of being able to do that. If you followed the channel for even just a couple of years, you'll know that this is probably my favorite support player in the world, and he continues to really kind of showcase that. But Hope was the follow-up. It's the bot lane that really stood out for AL once again in this series. Hope has been unreal kinds of good in 2025. Easily the best he's ever been throughout his entire career. There have been a lot of times where I've criticized Hope. I was not a fan of his game coming into 2025. Like, when you looked back on him last year, I thought he was fine. Like, certainly a decent weak side bot laner, but that team really needed more to kind of push them over the edge. It felt like, you know, Hope was one of the players that could have potentially been upgraded if they wanted to try to make a push for Worlds. And especially when you look back at, like, 2023 with him on WE, I was really not impressed with his gameplay. Even going back to 2022 on LGD Gaming, he felt like the weak link of a team that made the semifinals of Worlds. But this is the year where it feels like everything is just coming together. Mentality, mechanics, everything that you could ask for. He has been exceptionally good. Shanks was definitely better than Rookie in this series as well. I think that is huge for AL moving forward. I know I've said this over and over again, but I just have not really noticed Shanks all that much in 2025. I know that Flandre and Tarzan on the top side have definitely taken a lot of headlines, and we talked about Hope and Kale being really, really good, and Shanks has kind of fallen into the background because of that, but his landing stats aren't quite as dominant as maybe you would have expected them to be, but he definitely showed up here. The Tristana as the answer to the Yone in game 1, and the, you know, being able to move around the map on the Talia in game 2 was nice. Tarzan looks great on Xinjiao. You know, the Lily has always been one of his best champions, but there's really no way to be able to answer him when he has that kind of pressure in the top lane. And then Flandre on the Scion has been a dominant pick over the course of 2025. AL just looking really solid. And for Invictus on the other side, I just am concerned about the consistency of this team in basically any situation. I really like Jeje in the jungle. I think he's one of the best junglers in the LPL at the current moment. And while it wasn't perfect in this series, I certainly think he tried. Gala wasn't running it in the way that maybe he has at some points this year. He was incredibly good in the placement stage, a big reason why IG jumped up to number 2 or number 3 in my power rankings when we were talking about the best of ones. But as we get into these best of 3s, the same problems that this team had in the winter split are coming right back up here in spring. Mako's going to get done of the series. Rookie is getting outplayed in the mid lane. The Shy is a complete non-factor on the top side, and these are the players that are really supposed to push your team forward, and it's just not happening right now. Mako's getting done of the series because I can't spot a single play in the back half of game number 2 that was even remotely competent. He has just lost his mind. Like, I do not know what is happening. Even when he was playing poor on Edward Gaming in 2023, when Uzi came in and that entire team was just kind of up in the air, it felt like the communication was off. At least it felt like there was something to pull out of Mako's performances there. There's nothing to pull out of what he has been so far this year. He has just been a negative overall for Invictus. That is not good enough. He was the best support in the world for me last year, and he's been nowhere even remotely close to that so far in 2025. Rookie not only doesn't look like a top 3 or a top 4 mid laner, he looks like an average to slightly below average mid laner, especially for Group Ascend standards. If you're losing to Shanks, like, I love Shanks, but Shanks isn't exactly like the most dominant mid laner that you're going to be playing against in Group Ascend. If you're getting absolutely dominated by him, if you are, you know, on the Victor and doing negative damage at the end of game number 2, it's just not good enough. Like, I don't know what to say. Rookie feels like he's completely lost his way here. Rookie has kind of been on the downturn very quietly over the past couple of years, certainly in terms of consistency. This very much feels like top esports Rookie from 2023, and you can say the same thing for Mako. It feels like 2023 Mako, feels like 2023 The Shy, which is also kind of a negative in my opinion, where most games he's actually just entirely irrelevant. Obviously, the Cho'Gath in game number 2 had its advantages, but Fondre's way better on the top side. It wasn't even remotely close how relevant those two top laners were when going into each other. Like, yes, I like Jeje, but it's not like he was better than Tarzan. Yes, Gala has been solid and certainly much better over the course of spring, but Hope was a more enabled carry and certainly lived up to the billing a bit more. Like, how is IG supposed to be able to compete against these top teams? It's not just, oh, they want to be able to compete to be a top 5 or top 6 team in the LPL. That's not good enough for this roster. They want to make Worlds, and right now I'm just not sure they're on pace to do that, especially because they have struggled so much, specifically in best of 3s and best of 5s. But for AL on the other side, this is not a team I'm worried about in best of 3s and best of 5s. Outside of best of 1s, the only team to beat AL throughout this year has been Top Esports. There is no other org that's been able to take down AL in a best of 3 or a best of 5, and they continue that trend here. We'll see if that lasts over the course of this week, but this team is super dominant. If you wanted to make an argument that they're number 2 in the LPL at the current moment, there is a very easy case to be made there. I'm a little bit concerned about the upside of the talent, but they're going to have plenty of chances to prove it more throughout this week. Then moving on now to day number 3, and we move back down to Group Nirvana as we get a matchup between LGD Gaming and OMG, where LGD is going to pick up the 2-1 series win, and yet again, it's a roster and an organization making a roster change midway through the spring split with the hopes of just trying to survive in Group Nirvana. There is a lot of panic, I think, going on right now in terms of how a lot of these teams are thinking, and maybe there's not enough panic coming in from other organizations looking for some potential upgrades. It's certainly a questionable decision here from LGD, but it very much pans out in this first series. Nayu is going to be coming in as the starting jungler over Climber. I really like Climber. I think he's easily been the best player on LGD over the course of this year so far. Maybe not easily. Saucy has had some very interesting moments. He's just also had some absolutely tremendously bad games at the same time, but Nayu is a really interesting prospect. We got to remember when I was talking about this guy last year in January, where I was like, I'm not sure that he's going to be losing a starting spot as we go throughout the year. Now, obviously, that didn't end up working out. He was pretty bad for Rare Atom. It did not end up being a success story. They were absolutely horrible at the start of the spring split in 2024, but he gets another shot here to come back to LGD because he is such a talented player, and he makes the most of it in this first series. Not the toughest jungle matchup in the world. OMG kind of running it at times at the end of game number 3. This is a very sloppy and aggressive series, but having the talent to be able to pick up the slack there is pretty massive. So Nayu is going to get my player of the series, mostly for that Lilia game in game number 3. You can point to Saucy and, even YCX, I think, having a big impact on that game as a whole, but really for me, it's hard not to point to Nayu as the main character on the Lilia. He definitely made his presence known. Hang is not the toughest of competition, but it's nice to see that mechanical ceiling come through. Saucy has also been a player that's received a lot of headlines, and Harry is, pretty awful on the other side of this, and so Saucy had a pretty decent opportunity to be able to generate leads himself, which he did. He was really solid in this series when he wins. On the top side, he looks pretty good as a player. He certainly looks like somebody that can compete at this level. The problem is the losses are significantly worse than they are for other top laners. You just kind of have to take the good with the bad when it comes to Saucy. His bad games are horrendous, but Harry is not the kind of top laner that actively can go toe-to-toe with Saucy. We talked about OMG, and we'll talk about them a bit more. They are such a one-dimensional team in terms of how they play the game, and their weaknesses are so exploitable. They're kind of a worse version of a team like Ninjas in Pyjamas, way lower down on the standings, where if you can get that top side rolling against them, it's just really difficult for them to do anything, and that's exactly what ended up happening here in this series. So credit to Saucy, credit to Nayu, but it's not all sunshine and rainbows for LGD. They lost game number 1 for a reason, and their mid and bot just got completely outplayed. Zhao Qinghua is not playing well. Like, he is just not a good player. Don't be fooled by the scoreline. Don't be fooled by Xiaoya's scoreline as well down in the bot lane. Both of these guys tried to sell this series as much as possible. Linfeng and Starry are definitely the carries for OMG. They're the players that are really trying to push this team forward, but you need to be able to survive if you're Zhao Qinghua. You need to be able to survive if you're Xiaoya on the winning side of this matchup, because if Nayu and Saucy are going to be playing well on the top side, even if YCX is going to be able to generate some things down in the bot lane, your goal and your job is just to survive. You don't have to be main characters, but I'm super worried about the mechanical ceiling of these players. Linfeng and Starry are obviously some of the better mid and bot lane players in Group Nirvana, but there was no mechanical floor when it came to Zhao Qinghua and Xiaoya in this series. They got completely outplayed, and they're lucky to be walking out of this series, not only with the win, but not as dud of the series, because I really heavily consider both of them, specifically Zhao Qinghua in the mid lane, who I think did not have a good series. But at the end of the day, the win is all that matters. LGD picks it up 2-1, and OMG, what can I say about them that I haven't already said a lot over the course of this year? They're just so predictable. They're so one-dimensional in terms of what they are as a team. Linfeng and Starry are really good. Starry, in particular, is really, really good as an AD carry. There are so many AD carry prospects in the LPL that are so hyped up. He's kind of been clumped with players like Assume and even players like 1XM as the up-and-coming AD carry prospects. I've said for a while, I think the upside of Starry is the highest of all of those players. I really do love him individually as a player, and he was unbelievable in this series. The Jin game in game number 1 was excellent. He was so aggressive on the Corki and the Varus as we continued to move along in this series, and Lin Fang definitely followed up on that. It's not like his Aurora was bad at all in that first game. It's not like he was running it in game number 3 on the Yasuo, but it's the ancillary pieces, it's the supportive cast on this team that's just not good enough. Harry and Hang are the worst topside in the LPL, and that's the thing that's holding them back. That's the reason I have them ranked as a bottom 2 team right now, is because I just don't know if you can even survive on that side of the map. Hang is going to get dud of the series. I think Hang gets a bad rep, and I think part of it is definitely deserved. I think some of it just happens to be circumstance and the fact that he is a very one-dimensional player, but that one dimension is not even happening right now. He's got to win early. If he doesn't have a gold lead going into 10, 12 minutes into the game, he has no clue what to do, and he ends up completely throwing games away, completely out-jungled by Neyu. Obviously, a new jungler coming in sometimes has an advantage just because they have a little bit more time to, hide their strategy and prepare their own game plan, but Hang needed to be able to survive. He didn't do that. Harry is the worst top laner in the LPL, and he has been for a long time. The fact that this guy still has a job, quite frankly, in the LPL is staggering, in my opinion. He has never been productive at this level, and it's been 3 years. I don't know what else we're waiting on. He is holding this team back, and it's not like Moham was a ton better. He pulls out the elite support in game number 2, the greediest thing you can possibly go for, and yeah, it gets punished, and the Rakan also gets punished in game number 3. Like, there are real issues with OMG, and the problem is, they need to fix them now. Remember, this is single round robin, losing to LGD, going down 0-1 at the start of this stage. It's disaster for them. They've got to figure this out as quickly as they can, because Starry and Lin Fang do not deserve to be a bottom 2 team in the LPL, and for LGD, it's obviously a nice win. This team is pretty consistently outperforming expectations. I think there was an expectation that they would be bottom 2 from me and a lot of people going into this year. They're clearly not that. Neyu looks interesting as a player. Sassy obviously has that mechanical upside, but they are inherently limited by their carry duo of Zhao Qingwan, Xiaoye. If they're going to play like this, I think they're going to be pretty happy if they get 12th or 13th, but I certainly think it would be an option for them. Then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and a pretty predictable outcome here as we saw Team WE taking on JD Gaming, and JDG, of course, is going to pick up the 2-0 win. I think anything else would have been a pretty big catastrophic failure for them, although things became a bit more interesting with the aggressive dive comp for WE in game number 2. They've looked way better as a team when they can just rely on Monkey to try and take over on one of these carry-oriented junglers. It's clearly been a big upgrade for them in terms of their jungle position going from winter to spring now, but it's just not enough firepower to overcome what JDG is, and I think the encouraging thing was it was more of a team effort in this one than it has been at times in the past. When we've talked about JDG on this channel, we've kind of talked about it as a 2.5 player team with Paze and Scout playing really well at the start of this year, and Shun having some pretty decent performances in the jungle, just not being the most consistent player in the universe, but Ala in the top lane, Missing in the support position. They've just not been great at all in 2025. I think Missing has kind of had a track record of not being all that great last year as well, and so there have been some concerns with just what their upside can be, considering they're not like the most deep team in the world. But if you're gonna get performances like this out of Ala and Missing, things do become a lot more interesting, because Paze and Scout, they're gonna be able to show up. Shun is gonna be able to be important in those big moments, but if Missing's gonna win player of the series and really dominate in terms of his engage patterns like he was able to do in this series, that is gigantic. He was, in my opinion, very easily the best player in this series. I know Ala is gonna get a lot of hype for that Jace game in game number 2, and even Paze, I think, definitely deserves a shout here for being able to follow up on a lot of the creation, but Missing was probably the one that was doing the most, especially on that Alistair in game number 1. Really felt like that was an easy choice for the best game that anybody had in this series, and I'm going to repeat the point. If Missing is as good as he is here, or if, quite frankly, as good as he was in the placement stage, it does open up a lot more options for JDG, because this team has really struggled to find consistency in setting up their main primary carries. Paze has arguably been the best AD carry in the LPL so far in 2025, just in terms of raw production and his ability to play through bad situations. Scout, I think, has been totally fine. The issues with him in the mid lane are completely overblown. I think he's been way better than people give him credit for. If Missing is going to be that primary engage facilitator, the 2023 version of Missing and not 2024 or even early 2025 version of himself, that does open up way more options for this team. So credit to him. Ala also needs to be fine on the top side. What a weird year he has had so far. This is a guy who has basically never been bad at the LPL level. Even on bad teams, he has definitely shown up and been a consistent piece, like he was in spring for EDG last year, before he obviously leaves and goes to Anyone's Legend to try to upgrade that team and successfully does so. But man, his winter split was bad. Like, he just was not not a good top laner. His laning stats were not particularly good, and he was not making an impact on the game. He was actively holding this team back, and it looked like JDG very clearly lost the trade between them and Anyone's Legend for Flandre in the top lane, and obviously I think that still is the case. Flandre has been really that good for AL, but Ala can start to get back into form a little bit more here. The Kennen, but specifically the Jason game number 2 looking a lot more comfortable for him. I don't need to hype up Scout and Pays. If you watch the channel, you already know that. Pays is a menace. He is a monster, the best player to facilitate for in the entire league, in my opinion. If you just want some guy to dominate with resources, it's Pays. Like, you put him up in the top 5 to top 10 players in the world, I'm really not going to be all that against that idea. Scout's still really good. Shun still has those moments where it's like, you could have stopped the Neferi a bit more aggressively in game number 2. Xin Zhao, Vi, these are both options that, people have opted into as answers. The Poppy obviously on that list as well, but Monkey definitely got some things going on the Neferi. You can blame Shun a little bit for that, but he's been important in big moments for this team, so I'm not going to complain too much. JDG just kind of is who they are, unless they're not. And I know it's a weird sentence, but if Ala and Missing can step up and actually be top 5-ish players in their role, which of course they can be, we've seen it in the past from both of them, then the outlook of JDG gets a lot higher. All of a sudden, top 2 does not seem out of the realm of possibility for them, but we definitely need to see it more consistently and against teams that aren't WE. And for WE on the other side, I like Monkey. Karis I thought was fine in this series. Even Taiyun has really not been like the worst player in the world, but Vampire, just when this team is starting to step up, this is when he has the worst series he's played in a while. It's just a really disappointing time for that to end up happening. He's going to get dead of the series, was completely outplayed by Missing, his counterpart on the other side of this matchup. I've never been a Vampire defender on this channel. In fact, it's kind of been comical how much I've ragged on Vampire in opposition to what Reddit has been saying for a long time, but he is just not a good support player, and he still has a ton he needs to work on. Cube is also just a complete non-factor on the top side. Best case scenario for Cube is that he is like irrelevant in the game, is that you can just kind of win without him, and if that's the best case scenario and Ala is actually playing well on the Jace, like, yeah, the Mbessa looks entirely useless in that game number 2, and when you're relying on players like Monkey to be like a number 1 option for you in Group Ascend, remember, like, this team is not just going to be playing against, OMG and LNG over the next couple of weeks. They're going to be in a double round robin against the best teams in the LPL, and Monkey is the guy that you want to facilitate. Karis and Taiyun are the players that you want to push forward. That's not good. That's a bad situation for WE. I think it's likely only going to get worse. They've been top 11-ish in my power rankings. I don't think they're a top 10 team. I still wouldn't project that they're going to be able to make the playoffs, but you never really know. If Vampire plays like this, it's not going to help. If Cube is going to be a non-factor on the top side, it's not going to help, but really, for WE, it just comes down to whether or not the team they're playing into actually shows up on any given day, and JDG definitely showed up here today. They had a focus, they had a game plan, and they executed it well. Pays and Scout are excellent, but if Missing and Ala can step up, again, to reiterate the point, this team can be top 1 or top 2. That's certainly not out of the realm of possibility. Then moving on now to day number 4, and we kick day 4 off going back to Group Ascend with Weibo Gaming taking on Thunder Talk Gaming for the first time for them at the very least in week number 2, and Weibo is going to get some revenge for earlier on in the week against Top Esports by picking up a dominant 2-0 here, both games under 30 minutes, especially game number 2 was very much in their favor, and this is more of what you would have expected from Weibo coming into the actual Group Ascend here, especially against a team like Thunder Talk that they absolutely should be better than. I know a lot of people have hyped up Thunder Talk a lot. I have pushed back pretty heavily on that hype throughout the entirety of this year. It feels like a lot of the ways that they were able to generate advantages were very circumstantial, not necessarily repeatable throughout the entirety of the year, especially now that lane swaps are essentially dead and gone from the game. It's just hard for me to imagine a world where the top side of the map stays as healthy, or even really the soul laners at all stay as positive as they've been for the team. And unfortunately for Thunder Talk, that's exactly where they ended up faltering. Not that they didn't lose everywhere. It kind of felt like a pretty unwinnable series for them in terms of the talent disparity, but this is the Weibo Gaming we really wanted to see in terms of the team that, stepped up. I've kind of been singing this team's praises regardless of their results over the course of this year, because it just really feels like of all the teams in the LPL, they've had the worst luck of things when it comes to who they've had to go up against. They were in a group with JD Gaming at the beginning of Split 1 in the winter split. They aren't going to get first place in that group because JDG is just a better team, and, JDG is really talented, and so they have to go down through the lower bracket. Who do they draw in round 1? Bilibili Gaming. A pretty unfortunate set of circumstances. That's okay. We can go and win our group in the second split, in split number 2, in the spring split. Oops, we drew Bilibili Gaming in terms of who we have in that group as well. So it just feels like they've kind of gotten the short end of things, and we just saw them against Top Esports not really be able to hold their own, but this is a good team, and we continue to see some of these players stepping up when it does matter. Xiaohu in particular, the King of Spring, he's very much living up to that moniker at the moment. He's going to get player of the series, an absolutely dominant series from him. He was awesome at the beginning of the placement stage. Even when you watched him go into a player like Knight for Bilibili, he was winning that matchup and doing really well. We know Xiaohu can be a pretty inconsistent player, but this is the time of the year where he does step it up and, really become, the King of Spring, the Spring Tiger, whatever you want to call him, whatever nickname you want to give him. Satab is certainly not putting up the biggest opposition on the other side of this, but it still is really nice to see him be able to play things like Talia and continuously affect the map, even with things like Nefiri on the other side here. But you got to give a lot of credit to Breathe. We kind of criticized him earlier talking about, one of the reasons I've been a lot lower on Breathe is it feels like he is kind of limited in terms of his upside against the best top laners. Hoya is not the best top laner in the league. In fact, he's nowhere close. He's certainly a bottom 5 at the bare minimum top laner in the league, and I think that you could make the argument he's even lower than that in terms of the rankings, and Breathe definitely made it feel like that was the case in this series. The Ambessa, the Jace, both of those matchups ended up looking really positive. Light and Hong certainly were much more consistent. I thought Tian played really well throughout this series. Just a lot of good things to talk about for Weibo Gaming. It's hard to really narrow down one player or one specific activity, especially when the solo laners dominated as much as they did, because they won so dominantly and effortlessly, quite frankly, in both games, and the lasting impression here was just that there was such a seismic, gigantic gap between these two teams that it's hard to point out one or two players significantly more than the rest. But Xiaohu definitely deserves player of the series, and I want to give that shout out to Breathe. And on the flip side, I think you could say a similar thing, except the opposite, for the solo laners of ThunderTalk here, where Hoya and Satab are just, they're not group ascend players as much as they kind of pretended they were for times in the winter split. They're just not going to be able to survive at this level, and I wouldn't expect it to get better for this team. Hoya's going to get dead of the series for me. Aatrox and Gnar, I mean, what are you even expecting to happen here? He got completely outplayed on the top side. The difference in skill between Hoya and Breathe is gigantic, and we continue to see that be a massive issue for ThunderTalk, that they're not really able to hide or mask in the way that they were able to do it in the winter split. Lane swaps were obviously so prevalent and kind of the thing to watch out for. Hoya can't get out of these lanes now. We've, really seen a lot more top laners becoming, I want to say feast or famine, but, either player of the series or dud of the series in a lot of leagues around the world, because it's a lot more focused on whether or not you can get that advantage on the top side. Now, Hoya has not been good in the 1v1, and I think that was really expressed here, but it's not like Satab was a ton better. He continues to be a pretty big negative, and Xiaohu was everywhere on the map. If you're going to pick Ryze and Galio and really try to play this macro-oriented style around things like Nefiri and Tristana down in the bot lane, you have to have something in the mid lane, some level of pressure, and Satab just did not have that at any point throughout this entire series. Beishwan was definitely out-jungled by Tian when Beishwan has to face these really mechanically talented junglers, especially when he gets put on things like Nefiri. I love Nefiri as a champion, still incredibly busted, regardless of what people will say about the nerfs. When he's on these carry-oriented picks, this team just plays worse. They're not set up for Beishwan to be the primary option for them, and it continues to be a problem. 1xN and Feather were also just not the better bot lane here. I think that there are multiple times where they feel like no matter what happens, they're going to be stable on that side of the map. That was not the case, in my opinion, when you look at how these two games went. I just think they lost everywhere. You can't really point out a positive for ThunderTalk here. This is one of, if not their weakest series of the entire year leading up until this point. And yes, you can talk about the playoff series that they got obliterated by Bilibili, or even, some of the games that they've gotten obliterated by Bilibili and, already kind of losing to them in Group Ascend. There are negative games here for ThunderTalk, but you wanted them to be a bit more competitive. They've held on to that number 8 spot in my power rankings for so long because it does feel like they're the best of the rest. It's kind of being thrown into question here, but Weibo with a really nice win. Again, just getting back on track. This is a team that should be competing for top 4. Right now, they've not really been in that discussion because of their inconsistencies, but they absolutely have the talent to do so, and this is a really good start to that. Then moving on to our second series of day number 4 and kind of the end of the first half of the week here in the LPL, and it's a good one. It's Bilibili Gaming taking on Anyone's Legend, and AL picks up a gigantic 2-1 series win here, kind of cementing themselves back in the top 2 after what was not a bad placement stage, but certainly a more rocky placement stage than what we were expecting from this team. They made finals for a reason. Remember, this team was undefeated in not only best ofs, but in top, series, just in general. Best of 1, best of 3, or best of 5. Heading into the finals of last year, or of last split, they were dominant throughout Demacia Cup. They looked fantastic. They looked great in winter, and it was just that finals against top esports that they couldn't overcome. Things started to look a bit shakier for them after losing once again to TES, but it might just be that those are the two best teams in the LPL because they pretty clearly handled Bilibili Gaming in this series. And for BLG on the other side, I hate to be a broken record about this team, but man, their problems are very clear, and I just don't know if they're going to get solved or fixed over the course of this year. I think we have to really start having having a conversation about BLG, about whether or not this is even a team that should be competing for top 2, or whether or not their best case scenario was getting like 3rd or 4th in the LPL and hopefully representing the region at Worlds and not so much at MSI, which is a disaster for a team that went to World Finals last year. But we'll go ahead and talk about it. For AL, player of the series is super easy. It's got to go to Tarzan in the jungle. You're not going to, get too little Tarzan glazing out of me on this channel. I'm probably the biggest Tarzan glazer in the world. I've said it multiple times, I'm very biased towards him. He's my favorite player in the world. I do think he is the best jungler in the world, and it's because he does everything at a ridiculously high level. A lot of people are going to have their eyes drawn to the Nefiri game in Game 3, and I agree. Like, that Nefiri game was gorgeous, but the Xin Zhao in Game 1 was fantastic, and the reason that the Nefiri game ends up standing out even more for me when it comes to Tarzan is it's completely against the way that he ends up typically winning. Not that he can't carry games, but when I think of what Tarzan does at an incredibly high level, I think of Sejuani, I think of Zac, I think a lot of these tanky engaged threats that can be really aggressive in the mid game, even things like Maokai, he just plays them so much more aggressive than other players do, and that's where he's able to generate these leads. He plays these high floor champions and plays them so risky that it ends up really kind of comboing together well, and he has the mechanics to pull it off. But when he is able to get rolling on carries, it's not like he can't do that at a high level as well. It's not like he can't be what Canyon is for Gen G. He just is more versatile. I really do believe that Tarzan is the best jungler in the world at the current moment. Kanavi, obviously, in the LPL is putting up some fight against that. He certainly had a more productive split, but Tarzan, I think, is so well-rounded that it's really hard for me to shift off of that opinion. Flandre was also excellent in this series. He actually gets the Sejuani kind of move to him on the top side as an answer to the Scion, and it's a really interesting idea for AL. I really like the way that it ended up working out, but for the most part, it's off the back of Game 1 that I really want to shout out Flandre. That Jace game, and Jace in particular in the LPL, has actually looked really good over the course of this week. I'm interested to see if that's going to be able to hang on. Hope was the damage carry in both Game 1 and Game 3, really, with the exception of the Nefiri kind of popping off in the late game. The Kai'Sa was incredible. Kai'Sa obviously kind of the LPL AD carry, but Hope is one of the best Kai'Sas in the LPL, and this guy's just having a complete breakout year. Again, I've been low on Hope over the course of his career. That's no longer the case. Kale continues to be the playmaker and the facilitator for this team. I think they would have a lot more trouble running and operating in the way that they do without him. Shanks is still very good. Like, AL is just so complete. Taking down Bilibili Gaming is not easy, even for all of their flaws, and it just felt like AL was the better team pretty clearly in this series, which is a gigantic feather in their cap. And for BLG on the other side, there are real issues with this team, and it's in the exact places that we've been calling out. I don't have an issue with Knight. Knight is still arguably the best, player in the LPL. In fact, I would definitely make the argument he still is the best player in the LPL. Elk is still a really dominant carry when he is given resources. It's just so much more difficult for those two to get into the spots they need to be in order to take over these games when Jungle is playing, quite frankly, as bad as he is, and when one of Bin or On are just not, connected every single day. In this series, it was Bin who's gonna get that dud of the series. He was just worse than Flandre. I don't know what's going on with Bin and Mbessa. He is not good at this champion. It should be right up his wheelhouse, but it's really not been. The Scion was also just not effective enough in game number 3 for me to feel comfortable giving dud of the series to anybody else, but I certainly considered giving it to Wei. He just loses pressure instantly, and this is the problem with Wei. Wei, unfortunately, again, I hate to say, good take from me, but I thought it was ridiculous for this team to get rid of Shun and go for Wei. I ranked Shun higher than Wei coming into the year in terms of my jungle rankings, and that has been more than correct. Wei has not been good for Bilibili, and in fact, I think he actively limits the upside of what this team can accomplish. There was a reason they had to bench him at Worlds, because the ceiling with Wei is just not nearly as high. He is too slow of a player to play with the rest of this team. On, Elk, even Bin, they want to play fast. They want to play aggressive. They want to try to skirmish a ton. Wei does not do that, and in fact, he can't do that. He becomes a bad jungler when he ends up having to play that mode, and Tarzan just completely ran the map in game number 3. It's unacceptable for Wei to be playing the way that he is. Don't let the KDA fool you. It's not looking good, and he is an actual issue for this team. We'll see if it ends up being too big of a problem for them to be able to overcome, but it's certainly keeping them out of the top 2 for now. On ends up running it in game 3 on the Renata after having a tremendously good performance on the Rel in game number 2. I can't even criticize On all that much. At least he is attempting to do things, and like I said, I'm not blaming Knight or Elk. They're not the problem on the team right now. It really does feel like Wei is just kind of sapping a lot of the energy from this team, especially compared to what they had last year, and then, On's either running it in a game or Bin just doesn't feel particularly comfortable, and things are just not clicking for Bilibili in that way. And even if they are still a good team, a top 3 or a top 4 team, I would consider that a pretty big disappointment, quite frankly, for what their expectations were going into the year. But AL is just better than them in their current state. Players like Hope and Kale are better than Elk and On in terms of the production that's being put out. Tarzan is, in my opinion, the best jungler in the world. Flandre might might be the best top laner in the LPL at the current moment. Everything is working for AL. This team is really cohesive, and they have a clear identity with how they want to play their style, and it is pushing them into, once again, likely being a top 2 team. Then moving on now to day number 5, and once again, we've got some back-to-backs coming in here as it's Anyone's Legend going back onto the Rift. This time it gets FunPlus Phoenix, and just like last time, it is going to be a 2-1 series win, although it's definitely less impressive when it happens to FPX than when it happens to Bilibili Gaming. I'm going to cut them a little bit of slack. Not only were they able to pretty easily win the back 2 games of this series, it wasn't even particularly close, but I imagine a lot of the prep time over the course of this week was spent on Bilibili Gaming, not so much on FunPlus Phoenix, so I can kind of, understand maybe why game number 1 caught them a bit by surprise. And even that game was decently close. It just didn't end up going their way at the end of it. AL is definitely the better of these 2 teams, and I think that there is a little bit too much concern with them only 2-1ing and not being able to 2-0 any of these series. But FPX did put up a decent fight here. Taking a game off of AL is certainly no easy feat, especially when you're playing around a Kai'Sa. I think it can be pretty difficult to do that against teams that are really good at peeling for their primary carries. Hope on the other side on Jinx, Shanks on Azir. You definitely were getting a bit concerned the later that game ended up going, but Assume was a gigantic positive for them moving forward in that direction. The problem for FPX, unfortunately, was just that they could not keep that momentum up. Games 2 and 3, they kind of crashed back down to earth, and so we'll talk about that. But player of the series for me, gonna go to Kayle in the support position. This guy's incredible. I'm tired of kind of trying to hide my bias for him. I know I'm biased for Tarzan, and that's definitely a direction I've talked about. I'm really starting to get on the Flandre and Hope bandwagons here, but Kayle is a top 3 to 5 support in the world, and I don't even think it's debatable. I think there are very few supports that I would put above Kayle. Delight, for me, is pretty easily number 1 in terms of that list right now with how he's played over the course of 2025, but, Carry, he's had some good games, some bad games. I think it's worthwhile to put Lehen still in that conversation. There are other supports here in the LPL, like On, that I think still are very talented, but Kayle, is he a top 1, top 2 support in the LPL? Yeah, I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to talk about at this point. I've always hyped this guy up. Back in 2022, I was really pounding the table for him as one of the best supports in the world when he was playing with Prince and playing really well off of Krako, and it just feels like he continues to get better, and now that he's finally on a top tier team, a team that's actually contending to win a league, he is showing that he can be a pivotal piece on a team like that. His karma in game 3 was really nice, but it's his engaged threats that really make him a different kind of player. It's the Alistar in game number 2. It's his willingness to not sacrifice himself. I don't think that's a fair way to talk about that, but it's his willingness to say, who cares if I'm half health or below half health? If I see an angle to try to make a play against anybody, I'm going to try and go for it. I'm not scared to go out there and make plays. His vision control is actually second to none in the world. He is the best at getting vision of any player in the world. I don't even think that's debatable. He just has so many ridiculous tools. He's a great player. He's absolutely an asset to AL, and he continues to really push them forward. But, Hope is a big part of that as well. Hope continues to be kind of the resource getter for AL, and you wouldn't have expected that to be the case with someone like Shanks in the mid lane, but it's the Varus in game 2, it's the Ezreal in game 3, where you give him an inch, he's going to take a mile. You let Kayle set him up on the Alistar with that Varus in game number 2, and he's going to completely dominate in terms of the damage he's able to output. After game number 1, where it felt like Assume really was stepping up, Hope definitely took it upon himself to be, a huge asset for this team, and somehow, some way, he hasn't gotten a player of the series so far this week, even though in all 3 series, he has been absolutely exceptional for this team. Tarzan continues to look great. Flandre was great on the top side, pulls out the Yorick in game number 1. That's going to be a lot of the headlines, but, definitely, you can talk about the Poppy and the Aurora in game number 3 in a bit more of a positive light. Tarzan was definitely way better than Shadow. Shanks, like I said, much better as a mid laner in this series than Care on the other side. AL just feels so complete. There's only so much I can say about them that I haven't already said. This team is awesome, and for FPX, they put up a good fight. I honestly don't feel bad about how this team ended up playing here. I think that there was some concern that they were just going to get rolled, because I think, you look at FPX and you look at WE, these teams that are in Group Ascend, they're pretty clearly worse than everybody else. You were just worried that it was going to be kind of a stomp over and over again for these teams, that they weren't going to learn and grow or be interesting really at all, but that's not been the case for FPX. They've had some interesting moments. Unfortunately, they just don't have the consistency, and that really shows up in the mid lane. Kara is going to get dead of the series for me. The Tristana and the Ryze in particular in game 3 were just awful. He cannot play Ryze. Do not pick this champion for Care. We've already seen pretty regularly that if you're not a Ryze player, you look awful on that champion in pro play. That's been something that we've consistently talked about on this channel over the course of this year. like the difference between Showmaker and Doenby Rise and everybody else is noticeable. I think you really got to be that guy, and Care was just not that guy. But it's not like the Tristana was way better in game number 2. It just felt like they were setting up for a potential Yone and weren't able to get it. And it just ended up being a big problem for the team. But it wasn't just him. I think you can point out Shadow continuing to kind of just get out jungled by the actual good junglers at this level. Again, I think Shadow's been worse this year than he has been in previous years. I was a big fan of his in 2023 on Ninjas in Pyjamas. I think that there were, some shining lights on LGD for so many years. Obviously, going back to the Mad Lions days, there's definitely some takeaways, but, Shadow, I think, should be an okay jungler. It's just not really happening right now. He'd be one of the better junglers in Group Nirvana, but Group Ascend is definitely too much for him, as it would seem. Jway has not been nearly as successful so far. Assume and Jway were good in game 1 on the Nico and the Kai'Sa, but I was really underwhelmed by his engaged presence in the back 2 games here. Sheer is the main character of this team, but Flandre's just a little bit better. Regular takeaways for FPX, but at the end of the day, not only did they take game number 1, but they did it in a way that was pretty encouraging. They probably shouldn't have been able to out-teamfight AL throughout that first game, and they were able to do it anyways. Their goal is to stay competitive here and get as much momentum to go into that play-in series as they can. They're not going to be anywhere near top 4, but this could be a team that makes top 10 and makes playoffs, and that's definitely the goal. But for AL on the other side, the goal for them is to win the league. I certainly think it's realistic after they've started 3-0 this week. They're not even done in week 2, by the way, to expect this team to be the number 1 team in the LPL. They have so much going for them, and it feels like they can win in so many different ways through basically any lane that you have to look at this team as a major threat right now and a major favorite in the LPL, and anything less I think would be a disappointment. Then moving on to our second series of day number 5, and we finally get our first big upset of the week, I would say, with Invictus Gaming taking on Top Esports, and Invictus Gaming picking up a 2-1 series win, walking away from that game number 3 as the victors. This is a huge result overall, not just for IG, but for Top Esports as well. Every single person covering the LPL has kind of been preying on Top Esports' downfall, maybe with the exception of me. I'm a big fan of this team. I really like watching them play League of Legends when they play well, but everybody has been hoping and praying that at some point this team will slip up and not represent the region at MSI, and this is the slip up that I think a lot of people have been waiting for. Just go look at the Reddit post-match thread for this series. It's a lot of people talking about how finally Top Esports are losing and we're so excited. I think there was a legit Top Esports lost woohoo, and it got hundreds of upvotes, and that's just where we're at with this team. They finally falter basically for the first time all year, and a lot of people are excited, or at least domestically all year. But Invictus, how do we talk about this team without just saying what everyone is thinking? How can you possibly predict what this team is? Take all of the magic that Weibo Gaming have had over the past couple of years, mix in a little bit of Ninjas in Pyjamas with Rookie in there, and all of a sudden you've got this complete Frankenstein mixture of a team that just will never be what you expect them to be. Walking into this series, I didn't give them a real chance to be able to beat Top Esports, and that's exactly not only what they did, but that's the exact kind of scenario in which they're going to be able to walk out with the victory. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me, maybe shockingly, is going to go to Mako in the support position. I think a lot of people are going to want to give this to Gala because he was exceptional on the hyper carries in the back half, of the hyper carry in the back half of game number 3, the Jinx in particular, or Jeje for the setup, and quite frankly, the gigantic jungle gap that happened in game number 3. But to me, this series is way harder without Mako popping off on the Alistar and the Braum in game number 1. It really felt like he was the one controlling a lot of the tempo here, especially going back and rewatching the tape after watching it live. Mako did so much in this series to set up IG, to set up Gala, to set up Rookie, to set up the Shy on the Nidalee in game number 3, which we will obviously talk about. But Mako was, to me, the primary option and the primary playmaker for Invictus, and I just don't know if he's getting that kind of coverage and, notoriety. This is the kind of series that needed to happen. This guy, quite frankly, has just not been good, but leave it to Mako to go up against his former team from last year and kind of show, you probably should have kept me, and, obviously I'm sure they tried, but Mako, I think, made the decision to go over to Invictus, and, he's trying to prove that one to be correct. But Gala still was excellent. I'm not taking anything away from his Jinx performance in game number 3. Did a fantastic job at being able to be the primary damage carry there. I also see people kind of preying on the downfall of Jhin. You people are psychos. I'm tired of playing this game. Jhin's awesome. I love that champion, but Gala played better and certainly got more resources in game number 3. Jeje was incredible. Way better than Kanavi in that third game. I've been kind of going on and on and on, maybe annoyingly, about how Kanavi is running away with the MVP race so far in the spring split, and I still think he's in a good spot to be able to do that, especially even with the Neferi game in game number 2, but Jeje made him look silly in that third game. I think he was like 0-7 on the Sejuani, something absolutely ridiculous. That Skarner game, gorgeous from Jeje, and absolutely embarrassed him. He's been one of the best junglers in the LPL as well. This doesn't feel out of the realm of possibility. It doesn't feel like one of those games or performances that's just like, you chalk it up to, Kanavi being off and Jeje being able to capitalize on it a little bit. This is within the realm of possibility, for sure, and Jeje capitalized on that. And then you've got the Shy on the top side. I feel bad for 369 because he was definitely trying on the Renekton, but that 100% win rate in Italy has to stay active and has to stay alive with that game 3 pick. Only the Shy can get away with this. He's a dirty inter throughout most of this series, but it doesn't really matter. The moment he gets that in Italy, things just click for him. Even Rookie, on these more, I guess, controlled control mages, if you want to put it that way, things like Orianna and Azir, this is where he's been able to be a lot more consistent over the course of this year. I don't really want to see him on Aurora. I don't really want to see him on these more aggressive picks right now. It feels like the comfort zone for him is definitely those old school control mages. Just let him play that if he's going to play them at a high level. He was better than Cream in this series. So IG definitely has some things going for them, but this is a bad loss for Top Esports, not just because you lost, and that's not great. You probably wanted to be the best team pretty clearly in the LPL, but also, like, the way you lost was not encouraging. 369 continuing to play well, but that's really the only positive takeaway, in my opinion, for Top Esports in this series. I think a lot of people want to give dud of the series to Kanavi, and trust me, I get it. He was easily the worst player in game number 3. He had the worst game in this series, but it's just hard for me to give him dud of the series when he dominated on the Neferi in game 2, even if it is a Neferi game and that champion itself is already super broken. But because of that, it just was a little bit more difficult when Crisp was also playing pretty bad down in the support position and was an option for dud of the series. I am going to give it to Crisp here, mostly because his engages were just non-existent. He was so scared and so passive, especially in game number 3 on the Nautilus. It just felt like things were getting worse and worse, and he was constantly dying first in every fight. But if you wanted to give it to Kanavi, I'm really not going to object all that much. He did have easily the worst game of this entire series in the closeout. Cream, for the first time this year, really felt like he wasn't on the same level as the mid laner he was going into. Now, Rookie has certainly not been consistent at all, but once again, like, these control mage matchups might just not be Cream's forte. You might have wanted to try to unlock him a bit more, and that did work a bit on the Rise, but, that was mostly for enabling the Neferi. I think once the Talia and the Rise and things like that were off the board, just going to a Victor versus Orianna matchup doesn't really play into the strength of Cream, and that was a bit of a problem for them. Jackie Love on the Jhin is getting some criticism, I think rightfully so, but it's not Jin's fault, it's more Jackie Love's fault in terms of how things went down. Even Crisp, I think, kind of played into that. But Top Esports dropping their first series here of Group Ascend. Obviously, I'm not going to, claim this is a disaster. This is still likely the best team in the LPL. I'm not going to flip the script on that. IG can beat or lose to anybody on any given day, but it certainly shows that Top Esports are mortal domestically. And I think that's something we hadn't seen in quite a while. But for IG, it's not about the wins. It's about the losses for this team. It's not about what they can do on their best day. It's about what their worst days look like. And those worst days are still there, but it's nice to know they're starting to find a style that feels more comfortable for them. It's all about just unlocking it more regularly. But that's going to bring us to day number 6, our first of the weekend days, which means 3 series per day instead of 2. And kicking off day 6 was a matchup between FunPlus Phoenix and Weibo Gaming. With another upset, FPX is going to pick up a win, and they're not just going to pick up a win, they're going to pick up a 2-0 win, not drop a single game to Weibo Gaming. Unfortunately for all of us Weibo Gaming fans out there, they just can't stay consistent. They just can't find that form that they've needed to find for a little bit of time. They just feel like they are always going to be back and forth, and I get that that's just part of the roller coaster. That's part of the ride with Weibo Gaming. It has been for many years, but I really thought that there was some hidden upside with this team considering how things went at the start of this year. They've not necessarily lived up to that. This is a bad loss for them, arguably the worst loss we've seen so far in Group Ascend, and this is a gigantic win for FunPlus Phoenix. We've talked about it already pretty consistently throughout the week. The best case scenario for this team is them generating momentum and a bit of confidence going into that play-in stage so that they can get into the playoffs, and they really are on pace to do that right now. So let's go ahead and talk about how they got here. Obviously, player of the series is Shadow. If you watch these games, you don't need me to tell you that. This was a dominant Lilia game in game number 2. Certainly one of the best games we've seen out of Shadow in a long time. This definitely reminded me a lot more of that Ninjas in Pyjamas Shadow, even the LGD version of Shadow we had a couple of years ago, where it felt like he was being given a lot more resources, and he was kind of being relied upon a little bit more to be a primary carry, but he's going into Tion in this series, and to just completely out-jungle him, quite frankly, is massive. Tion had a really bad week for Weibo. There are some really concerning traits there in terms of his consistency that I'll talk about more when we go to the other side of this matchup, but for Shadow to be able to step up and really pop off in that second game is really cool. Obviously, he did that against Ninjas in Pyjamas in the placement stage in that game that they weren't taking all that seriously. Doe and Beast Pantheon going like 0-12 or something like that, but we know Shadow can have those good performances. He snowballs incredibly well as a player. I just need to see more consistency out of him as a player. It's really nice to see the upside, though, in Group Ascend against a really good team, but it wasn't just him. I really want to give a big shout out to both Assume and Jway, who I thought played this series really well. Jway was definitely the better support here. Thresh is not something that I think is very playable, quite frankly, on the current patch, but playing it into something like a Felios on the other side of this matchup certainly makes it a little bit easier. There's just so many AD carries that I think can do a lot into Thresh and kind of punish him a bit more early game. Aphelios, not that champion, and Jway, I think, really was able to capitalize on that. You know, like I said, he definitely was the better support here, and Assume continues to look really good. I might be undervaluing what he is as a player. He might be a lot closer to what, you know, I was talking about On being last year, although I don't think he has those, like, high highs, but the floor of Assume is a lot higher than I think I've been giving him credit for. He absolutely can carry games at this level. He does need to be enabled a little bit more than other AD carries, but if you wanted to call him a top 7 or 8 AD carry, like, that's a pretty easy argument to make at the current moment with how he's playing. Even Care looked pretty solid here against the Spring King in Xiaohu on the other side. Sheer was definitely much more of a frontliner here, and Breathe definitely tried to be a bit more aggressive in that matchup, but FPX was the better team by a considerable margin, and in these sloppy, chaotic, high kill-oriented games, you would think Weibo would be able to generate the advantage there, but it actually really played into FPX's strengths. And then for Weibo on the other side, this is a bad loss. In fact, like I said earlier, I think this is the worst loss any team has had so far in Group Ascend. This kind of takes Weibo out of that top 4 discussion at the current moment, and especially with how many teams are just so up and down. Like, does this make them a top 7, top 8 kind of team instead of a top 6 kind of team? That is a real problem for Weibo Gaming because they just can't find that consistency. Dud of the series can go in 2 ways, in my opinion. It either goes to Tian or it goes to Hong in the support position. I'm giving it to Hong because I think he was worse in terms of his individual performances, but Tian got mega out-jungled by Shadow. He just tried to be able to pull some plays back and it didn't work. Hong was just bad throughout this entire series. You're looking at that KDA, and honestly, I think it accurately sells what he was doing. Jway was so much more proactive on the map. Hong was attempting to make plays, but they were way too late. They were improperly timed with the rest of his team, and he felt very disconnected. When you pick something like a Felios in game number 2, you're clearly trying to play around a light win condition, and to completely abandon him at multiple points and just kind of go do your own thing, very weird gameplay coming in from Hong. It's pretty atypical from him as well, so not a great series from Hong. You know, Tian, like I said, was already kind of bad. Breathe was better than his scoreline would indicate. He continued to play well this week. Sheer is a good top laner. It's nice to see Breathe actually be able to go up against him, but that's like the only positive. Xiaohu was not as good as Care. Light certainly was not nearly as good as Assume, even if it wasn't entirely his fault. This is a bad loss for Weibo Gaming. They need to get back on track as soon as possible because at least for the moment, things are really going wrong for the team, but for FPX, really big win here. I think just staying competitive in Group Ascend is going to be kind of the dream for FPX, but for now, they're more than competitive. They're taking a 2-0 series off of a team like Weibo Gaming. If they can end this Group Ascend with 3 or 4 series wins, I mean, you're talking about a team that could be near top 6 or top 7, which felt completely out of the realm of possibility for this roster. So this all of a sudden opens up a lot of new opportunities, and this is a really nice win for FPX. Then moving on to the second series here of day number 6, and it's another fun outcome as we saw Thunder Talk Gaming taking on Invictus Gaming, and IG once again is going to pick up a series win here, except the 2-1 looks a little bit more interesting when it's Thunder Talk and not Top Esports on the other end of it. Still, a win is a win, and the old Invictus Gaming probably would have lost this series, and so you feel pretty good about picking up the win here, but, you know, still some things to take away. I think obviously the main one, the second time we see the Shies Nidalee in game number 3 throughout this week, but the first time we really see it dominate and really see it kind of take over in game number 3. He got a gigantic lead into Hoya on that Yorick in game 3. It's not the last time that, you know, the Shy will be using that as a counter pick against a Yorick. Spoilers for week number 3, but, you know, it's really nice to see it pop off and kind of make it worth it over the course of this third game. Still 100% win rate, but that's not going to be my player of the series here. Player of the series kind of has to go to somebody who was good throughout all 3 games, and to me, I think Jeje encapsulates that pretty heavily. Not only was he the facilitator in game 3 on the Jarvan, a champion we're honestly not seeing all that much. I think that there are pros and cons to Jarvan. Quite frankly, the way I viewed him is always as a slightly worse version of Vi in this current meta, where You do really want to be able to generate that pressure early. You need to be able to skirmish and, start your team off with a lead. If you don't really have a gold lead going into 15 minutes, that champion can get a little bit weak just because you have to go in, you have to commit in order to do anything. And if you don't have the gold to be able to survive, you're just going to get bursted down super quick. But Jeje obviously had a great early game, was able to enable this Nidalee to be a big problem, get a gigantic CS lead on the top side with a player diff in the Shy versus Hoya, especially mechanically speaking, and then use that to translate pressure elsewhere on the map. It's really nice stuff from Jeje. I did also consider Rookie for player of the series, not just for the Azir game in game number 1, which, by the way, I want to make it clear, just play Azir every series. Rookie's Azir is incredibly good. It's obviously always been a huge pick of his, but at least right now, looking at the difference between how he plays on things like Azir and Orianna versus everything else, it's gigantic. Not that he's been awful on things like Sylas and Aurora, obviously he can play these champs, but it's way more inconsistent. Just let him play front-to-back team fights. Let him be Azir. Let him be Orianna. It's going to feel a lot better for Invictus Gaming moving forward, I think, if you start to commit to that playstyle. But jungle mid looking good here. Again, you got to point out the Shy because of Nidalee. I wasn't in love with how he played the rest of the series. His game 2 was awful on the Gwen, a champion that basically everybody has been dominating on in the LPL so far this year. It looked unplayable for him. Hoya completely gapped him on the Rumble, which is a really bad sign, but that's the reason he's not getting player of the series. Still get to point out the good play in game 3 and even in game 1 on the Sion. Gala ended up doing a ton of damage down the stretch in that third game on Varus. He just needs to be given the opportunity to be able to free hit. And Mako, once again, a back-to-back good series from him. We haven't seen that in quite a while. So good stuff overall from Invictus. They picked up a win that they should have picked up. Probably don't love dropping game number 2, especially with the Shy kind of running it down. But at the end of the day, a win is a win. And for Thunder Talk, nice game win. I think you're going to be walking out of this series at least feeling okay with that. And I think there are positives, like Beishwan and Hoya played great in game number 2, even, 1xN, I think, had a really solid game on the Ezreal. It just was not able to last through that third game where they did kind of get trounced. Dud of the series for me, even with the good game number 2, is going to go to Beishwan in the jungle. He just was completely outplayed in the games that really mattered. Game 1 was not good. Game 3 was even worse, in my opinion. When you're going to play something like Sejuani, you should pretty permanently have the advantage into something like Jarvan, because time is almost always going to be on your side, especially with something like Yorick on the top side, and even Victor in the mid lane. This feels like a pretty complete draft to just not screw things up in the early game, and unfortunately for Beishwan, he just kind of had to screw things up. But Jeje is one of the best junglers in the league. You can kind of accept that he's going to lose there. Unfortunately, as I've talked about multiple times on this channel, Beishwan is the pivot point for Thunder Talk. When he wins, this team wins. When he loses, this team loses. It doesn't really matter what happens elsewhere. Hoya was excellent in game 2, but that Yorick got punished really hard by the Nidalee in game number 3. Satab continues to not be nearly as good as every other mid laner from a mechanical perspective here in Group Ascend. He just can't even really stay alive at times in these 1v1 matchups. Feather has started to look a little bit more mortal. 1xN is fine, but he's certainly not breaking any ground. I would say someone like Assume has honestly performed better so far in his limited time in Group Ascend. Thunder Talk have a lot of problems going for them right now, and unfortunately, I just think that they overperformed at the beginning of the year. The expectations got set too high, and now they're not able to live up to them. Are they a top 8 team? Maybe right now. Are they a top 9 or 10 team? That might be more realistic in terms of how we look at them moving forward. I still expect this team to make playoffs, but, Group Ascend definitely seems too tough for them, and Invictus kind of showed that here. This is a team that's not consistent, but still was able to get consistent leads against them. I think they're finally starting to find a format that really works for them with Rookie on these control mages and Jeje just playing something that can be aggressive in the early game, play around the players' strengths, and play around the players that have been playing well throughout the whole year. Jeje and Gala have definitely been the strength of this team so far, and it feels like they're opting into that now. Then moving on to our third series of day number 6, and it's the big one here on the 6th day. It's Bilibili Gaming taking on LGD Gaming, and JDG picks up a very big 2-0 win here. Obviously, it's not the most shocking win in the world, especially after how BLG looked earlier on in the week against Anyone's Legend, and JDG in general looked great earlier on in the week as well, but it's really nice to see because it just kind of compounds what we were talking about earlier on in the week for JDG, where while their top-end talent has always been incredibly good, and we know that we're not super worried about Pays and Scout, it's always been about whether or not this entire roster can step up and be elite, and it does feel like they're all playing, at least as a unit, better now than they were at any point at the beginning of 2025, and that already was a top 3 team. You have to remember, they were in winners finals of the playoffs in the winter split, and so they could be even better right now. And for Bilibili, It's just everything going wrong. I can't remember a time where this team played a series worse than this. Even against ThunderTalk in that best of 5 that they lost in kind of the regular season, the group stage of winter, it wasn't this bad. Everything is off kilter right now for BLG. There are so many things going wrong from a communication and even just like a playstyle perspective. I just don't know if this team is ever going to be on track with these 5 members, and I'm going to drill the point home. And now it's just bleeding into more than just Wei and On to, having some negative games. It's bleeding into Knight, who had the worst series I've ever seen him play. Even someone like Bin, who was just bad over the course of this week, got outplayed in this series by Allah. And that takes us to JDG, because player of the series absolutely is Allah on the top side. And he had a really great week number 2, easily the 2 best series that he has played on JDG so far. I really was starting to get concerned because, quite frankly, his winter split was kind of bad. It wasn't just average, it was below average. Him and Missing were actively negatives for JDG, and they were winning kind of in spite of those 2 players. And so for Allah to pick the Yorick here in game number 2, go into that Sion and actively be able to step up and take over the game, it's a great look, especially compounding that off of what he was earlier on in the week, where you're already kind of considering his Jace to be one of the scarier threats. We know this guy should be a top 3 top laner in the league, or a top 4 at the bare minimum top laner in the league, and it's kind of what the expectation was. It's the reason JDG went out and got Allah in exchange for Flandre. They felt like they were upgrading in the top lane, but it just hadn't worked out like that. It's nice to see that that's still in there, and it's nice to see that he can still be a guy that, competes, especially mechanically speaking, as one of the best players in the region. Scout going deathless in this series, I think, has to be pointed out. Quite frankly, this was a ginormous mid-gap in this series. I love Knight. Trust me, I'll talk up Knight whenever. This is the worst I've ever seen Knight play. That game number 1 on Azir was unplayable for him, and Scout punished him over and over again. This was gorgeous from Scout. I'm so tired of this fictional narrative in my eyes that Scout has not been good over the past year or so. Him and Weiwei had no synergy together as a jungle mid duo, and the moment that Weiwei started putting his own pride on the back burner, Scout instantly became one of the most productive players in the LPL in the summer split. He ended up getting that team to Worlds on LNG last year, and he performed incredibly well at Worlds. People forget that because he went out in the quarterfinals and wasn't perfect against Weibo Gaming, he was probably the most productive player in the Swiss stage of anybody in the entire tournament. I mean, Owner probably gave him a run for his money in that regard, but Scout was excellent at Worlds as well. This is a guy who I don't understand where the narrative has gone on him. He is a top 2 mid laner, top 3 at bare minimum in the LPL right now, and arguably top 5 or 8 in the world, and I just don't know if he's getting that recognition in terms of his form. Pace continues to be great. Shun was solid here, didn't take over on the Nefiri, but definitely was the better jungler, and Missing continues to look awesome as the primary playmaker. 0-4 and 25 for him. The KP is absolutely outstanding here, but overall, this is just a team gap for JD Gaming. They were the better team by a large margin, and that's huge for them, and it's awful for Bilibili on the other side. What else do you even want me to say? Like, it's just become comical at this point how little these guys actually, synergize together, and it just makes their offseason decision even more questionable, right? They let go of Shun on the other side of this matchup, who was the better jungler in this series, the guy who got them to World Finals in order to fully commit to Wei as their starting jungler, something they used for the most part in the summer split, but it's just gone downhill. It's gone south incredibly quickly, and Wei has been awful for this team. He's going to get dud of the series here, although I do think it's up for debate. I do think there are other options, like Knight, which we will obviously touch upon as we continue to go along. Even On, I think, played awful in game 2. The Elise is such a greed pick after getting demolished in game number 1. It's actually completely unacceptable, in my opinion. Bin was certainly the worst of these 2 top laners. It looks like he's completely mentally disconnected at the current moment, but Wei is the core of the problem for me. I mean, he is actively bringing this team down in terms of what his skill level is. Again, I hate to, kind of beat the nail on the head because I've said this over and over again, but I've always been a Wei doubter. Even going back to the RNG days, it felt like he really was kind of enabled in a lot of ways there. I think especially talking about what he was in 2024 before he came over to BLG, I was kind of pushing back. I was really aggressive on this channel about, if they replace Shun with Wei, they are stupid and they are actively sabotaging their team. Wei obviously came in and was a lot better than I expected for Bilibili, but there was a reason they went to Shun at the World Championships when it mattered the most, because again, that ceiling was raised and, a lot of these players wanted to play with a more aggressive jungler. Wei is just not fitting on this team. He cannot play the style that On or Knight or Bin want to play, and he's constantly going to be conflicting with that, and on top of that, he's already not playing well at his own individual style and is getting outplayed. At best, he's a top 5 or 6 jungler in the league, and that is just not good enough for Bilibili Gaming. They definitely downgraded in the jungle, and I feel pretty proud of my take saying that Shun was going to be better this year than Wei. That has definitely lived up to its fruition so far, but man, Knight deserves this dud of the series. Like, I have never seen Knight play like this. It was actually horrendous. This is Air Game in Game 1. Laughably bad. Scout completely embarrassed him in this series. The Corki is the only thing that's even remotely pulling this back, and even then, he was kind of donated a ton of gold and kills on that Corki. The scoreline is not, indicative, I think, of what his performance looked like. This was a bad series from Knight. Bin was definitely the weaker of these two top laners, and Ollie's been in bad form on the other side here. On was actively running it again. The greed to pick Caitlyn Elise in game number 2 when you just got slaughtered in game number 1, absolutely outstanding. Elk was pretty good in this series. He did absolutely everything he could, and he still is a great player. I still would consider him one of the best AD carries in the world. I said he was the best ADC in the world last year. Obviously, he's not had that opportunity so far this year, but he's still excellent. It's just this team does not have any synergy. It doesn't have any cohesion, and it doesn't come out against like the mediocre teams. They can beat teams like Weibo. We've seen that over the course of this year, but against JD Gaming, against anyone's legend, against top esports, do I think Bilibili right now in their current form has a chance against those teams? No, I really don't, and I honestly don't think it's close. They have a lot they need to work on before they're even in consideration for being near the top of the standings, but for JD Gaming, they are still up there. I perhaps was a little bit too ambitious in their drop at the end of week number 1, just kind of taking too much away from their loss. There still is a lot of good here, and especially because it does feel like this team is kind of building on top of itself. There's still a lot of good league left to be played for JD Gaming, and I think their record does kind of show that now. But that's going to bring us to our 7th and final day of the LPL for week number 2. Again, thank you so much if you've stuck around this long. It really does mean a lot if you watch all the way through these videos. But kicking off day number 7 was a matchup between Ninjas in Pyjamas and Team WE that NIP is going to take the 2-0 win in. And while these games were a little bit chaotic and they certainly weren't free wins at all for NIP, they definitely got the job done. And they once again just got to play through their star players. I hate to say that their strategy has also become very easy to spot and be able to kind of execute against, but if you don't have the top side to be able to take advantage of Shanji and Aki, which have been kind of the weak links of NIP over the course of this year, then you're just not going to be able to beat Doanby, Leave, and PP God. They've been very consistent on the bottom side of the map, and for WE, while they do have some strengths on that side, Monkey in particular is probably the best player on this team right now, and even Taiyun, I think, has definitely been playing better over the course of Split 2 than he has at any point throughout his entire career up until this point. WE really are never going to be able to generate those kinds of early leads. They're not going to be able to punish the mispositions and the mistakes that Shanji and Aki make because those players still are pretty mechanically talented, and WE kind of have to overcome that hurdle and that barrier first and foremost. But NIP, on their side, player of the series, kind of tough, man. Not because everybody was bad or that nobody really showed up, but Doanby and Leave were both excellent, and I think really you could highlight either as the player of the series. I'm going to give it to Doanby. It felt like his contributions were a little bit more flashy than what Leave's were, but Leave was probably a bit more productive under the hood in terms of the things that happened, and generally I also think that Leave had a harder laning phase, not because I think Taiyun and Vampire were unbelievably strong and dominant, just rather that I think WE put a lot more pressure onto the bottom side of the map than whatever Karis was putting up in the mid lane, and so you can give a bit more credence over to Leave in that regard, but Doanby to me is still the main character of Ninjas in Pyjamas. He's the identity creator for this roster, and he continues to really push them forward in that regard. The Silas, the Victor, everything looks really nice. Of course, Karis kind of assisting with that on the other side of this matchup, not playing particularly well, but still, like, Doanby getting out on the map, moving around, and then being such a team fight menace, like, that's where NIP really kind of draw their identity from. Leave definitely plays into that as well, but they're such a good 5v5 team in most cases, not in every case, but in most cases, there's such a good 5v5 team, and Doanby is a big reason for that, but Leave was awesome, and he has been great over the course of spring. He was the first team All-Pro AD carry in the winter split. I didn't agree with that at the time. I thought Pays was significantly more valuable to his individual team than Leave was, but I'm starting to see it here in spring, and trust me, I've been on the Leave bandwagon before. Go watch my 2023 Edward Gaming analysis when he was kind of put in as that next big AD carry prospect. I was calling him a borderline top 5 AD carry in the LPL back then, and then all the drama happened. He lost his spot, yada, yada, yada. You know, he had to find some consistency, and I think, unfortunately for him, he didn't really have that last year. There were a lot of ups and downs for him in 2024, you know, going to Ninjas in Pyjamas, really being given kind of the keys to the kingdom on this team as a primary carry option. He really needed to step up and show show that that mechanical ceiling that we know is there, like he's one of the most mechanically talented players in the whole region, can still be reached. And right now, at least with the guidance of players like PP and Doenby, it is working out. PP was really solid here. Aki was totally fine. Shanji was nice as the Scion on the top side, as that weak side tank player. You know, that's kind of the perfect role for him at the current moment with where he's at. But Ninjas in Pyjamas just playing their style, doing their thing, and taking care of business. And for WE on the other side, they just don't have the talent, quite frankly, or the firepower, whatever you want to call it, to be able to overcome Ninjas in Pyjamas. Credit to Taiyun, credit to Monkey. I think they're attempting to do things. Monkey definitely was outplayed in this series by Aki, wasn't really able to generate it, but it's so hard when your mid laner is just one of the worst in the entire league. Karis is going to get done to the series. Karis being in Group Ascend is insane. This guy is truly awful. So you could say the same thing about basically everybody on this team, with the exception of Monkey, who I think has been an interesting player, but Q being in Group Ascend, Taiyun and Vampire as a bot lane being in Group Ascend, it's kind of insane. But Karis, I think, especially stands out as somebody who just does nothing except for make bad plays. Like, he's really passive in terms of when this team is trying to play on the front foot, and when they're on the back foot, he's way too far forward. It just feels like he's never in the right place at the right time. He's gotten worse over his 3 or so years at a top level. You know, I talked about it a lot in the LCK. He was given chance after chance on Hanwha Life and then on Bro, and it just never really came to fruition. And now he's over here in the LPL, and he continues to be a detriment to the team that he's on. Karis is not a good player, and he continues to get exploited by good mid laners. Vampire, I think, was also kind of bad here. Cube was really useless on the top side. Jax is just a pick that I'm really starting to give up on. I get that there are moments where this champ can look strong, but I really just do not see it, especially if you're like the team that's not expected to win. If you're playing from behind, I just don't see a reason to pick Jax. I think it's way too difficult to execute with the way that the map has ended up developing. You know, overall, there are options for WE, but I expect this team to continue to really struggle and barely pick up any wins at all in this stage, if any. This could be a team that ends up going winless, and I don't think anybody would be all that surprised. And for Ninjas in Pyjamas on the other side, it's a nice win, but it's against WE. You need to see this team pick up wins against the actual top 6 teams. That's what's been keeping them out of that top 6 conversation, is the consistency against actual good teams. And so far, they've only really been able to pick up wins against those teams when they're downplaying their own experience. Nothing here kind of changes my mind on that. It's really just up to Doenby and Leave to be able to be those primary options and for the top side to survive. I think it's definitely possible for them, but nothing here that really changes my opinion on the team all that much. Then moving on to our second series of day number 7, and yet another predictable outcome. ThunderTalk Gaming taking on Top Esports, and Top Esports picks up the very easy 2-0, probably the easiest series that they've had all week, although I will say it's not like it was particularly difficult for them before that Invictus series, but it's a nice bounce back after what was a pretty disappointing result in their third series of the week. 4 full best of 3s for them, and they dominate 3 of them. Overall, it's still a good week for Top Esports. They were pretty overloaded in terms of their schedule, and they still came out on top and really dominated. ThunderTalk are just not good. Like, I hate to say it, their solo laners are just the worst. Like, maybe not the worst, because Karis and Cube are definitely going to put up a fight in that department, but I think they're easily bottom 2 in terms of Group Ascend. Like, Hoya and Satab are bottom 4 in the league in terms of what the solo lane duos are. There are plenty of solo lane duos in Group Nirvana that I think would be better than ThunderTalk's right now, and it means that it doesn't matter what 1xN or Beishwan are doing. It doesn't matter the kind of creation that they're able to get out of themselves. This team is going to be kind of behind the 8 ball in basically every circumstance with how these solo laners play, but Top Esports did a great job capitalizing on that. And just as we criticize the solo laners of ThunderTalk, we got to praise the solo laners of Top Esports for being able to really push that advantage. Most notably for me, Cream in the mid lane, who's getting player of the series. I'm a big fan of Cream. I've said it over and over again on the channel. It's not like that's going to be surprising anybody who has been around for a very long time. The Akali, the Yone, all of it. Cream has been a channel darling. Basically, I think the first channel darling back in 2021 when I started covering the LPL on this channel, at least officially. I think Cream was the first player where I was like, oh, this guy's going to dominate. Back when he was Crime on OMG, loved his gameplay and his mechanical ceiling. He has done everything to live up to that. I think his growth as a player on Top Esports is honestly under talked about. He's such a versatile player, but old reliable is still there. He can still play those mid lane melee assassins. He still very much is in the mold of a player like Zeka, who I think obviously was another channel darling. But Cream is incredibly talented, and if Satab is going to be your opposition, yeah, let Cream work. Let him go to work. Let him destroy that mid lane matchup like he did in this series. In 369, he had a great week. I think it's going to be a bit undersold, not only because the big takeaway is going to be Top Esports loss to Invictus, even if I really don't think it should be, but also Kanavi's going to steal a lot of the headlines for the good games earlier on in the week. And I think think Cream was a little bit more flashy here, but 369 decimated Hoya in that 1v1, and overall, he had a fantastic week. Even against the Shy, he looked pretty good in that matchup, and that's really the only negative that you can talk about for top esports, really throughout the entirety of this split up until this point. 369 has been dominant, has really started to get his form back. He's another player who has done a lot better in spring than he has in summer. We'll see if that trend continues. Jackie Love goes deathless. Crisp 1-1 in 24. I think that does show up in terms of the actual gameplay. Overall, way better as a bot lane here. Kanavi as the facilitator, pulling out something like the Nidalee in game number 2. It's just a good look for top esports. They really dominated this game, had full control of what they wanted to do, and executed on it well, but for Thunder Talk on the other side, it's super easy to talk about because, again, like, I like Beishwan, I like 1xN. They tried their best in this series to be proactive. Beishwan in particular, I think, actually played fine into Kanavi. This was a relatively neutral jungle matchup, all things considered. You know, Nidalee, Sejuani can kind of muddy the waters a bit when it comes to how that actually goes down, but Hoya gets decimated on the top side. The Gwen is useless in game 1, like super useless in game 1, and he gets absolutely brutalized on the Ornn in game number 2, and then Satab is just, like, allowing Cream to do whatever he wants. Not only is he able to decimate him 1v1 in the lane, but Cream gets to move around the map, play with his jungle, play with his support, and really just open up everything for top esports, and Satab's not even trying to establish pressure somewhere in a side lane. Like, he just gives up halfway through this. Satab and Hoya are not playable in Group Ascend, and I hate to keep using that term, but man, it is just very clear the players that are not good enough to go up against the best players in the region over and over and over again, game after game, and I think Hoya and Satab are going to continue to kind of get exposed in that regard. You know, 1xN and Feather, I think, could have been better. It's not like they were as good as Jackie Love and Chris, but I'm certainly not blaming them. And like I said, Beishwan actually played, I think, totally fine in this series. He did everything he could, but when your solo lanes are going to run it in the way that happened here, it's just unwinnable. So for Thunder Talk, I'm starting to get weaker and weaker on their upside as we continue to watch. Now, you know, them versus FPX, you know, versus WE, do I think they're in that conversation? I think FPX has really cemented themselves as a team that could be in the top 8, and you could make a reasonable argument is in the top 8, but Thunder Talk has always felt like the separator. Like, the 7 teams above them are way better than them, and the teams below them probably aren't on their level. Unfortunately for Thunder Talk, they're just basically going to have to play those top 7 teams over and over again, and so it's not going to feel all that great, but it's hard for me to completely turn around on what we saw before Group Ascend started. That being said, Top Esports is probably still the #1 team in the LPL. Anyone's Legend has certainly made a really good argument, but Top Esports beat them for a reason in week #1. This is still the team to beat, regardless of what Reddit wants them to be, considering their performances, and I think they back that up here. But that's going to bring us to our third series of day number 7 and our final series of week number 2. And it was a matchup between Anyone's Legend and Weibo Gaming. And both of these teams kind of continuing from where they left off in their previous series for both good and bad. AL taking a dominant 2-0 win, both games under 30 minutes. You know, an under 1 hour series is never a good sign for a team like Weibo that has super high expectations. And they had a lot of concerning traits over the course of this week. 2 players on this team I thought were absolutely horrendous. I think that there was one player that really stood out as being actually good for Weibo. Maybe not perfect, but certainly good enough throughout a lot of this entire week, but AL was just better everywhere. Not that that should be a surprise to anybody. This team, from this point onwards, is expected to win every single game, every single series that they run into, but for now, again, you need to see some sort of competitiveness coming out from Weibo, and it's just not happening. Player of the series, though, on AL for me is going to go to Shanks in the mid lane. The one player that we've spent the least amount of time talking about is the one that stands out the most in this series. You know, Xiaohu's obviously been pretty good throughout the spring split, but Shanks has the ability to step up. We just saw some limit testing coming in from Cream. Well, Shanks is a pretty similar player, kind of built in a similar mold, and Shanks is like, hey, you can play Akali, I can play Akali. We're both going to pop off on the assassins here today, and it absolutely ends up working out. It's the Talia in game number 1 as well that really seals this for me, though. As much as the Akali was kind of the main character of that second game, I just loved the consistency for Shanks over the course of this series. Really happy to see him really start to step in, and I think the only unfortunate thing about all of this for me is that this is the 4th series in a row this week where I almost gave Hope player of the series. Somehow, some way, he was the second player of the series in all 4 of their series. Absolutely ridiculous. I feel bad that he didn't get even one of them, but Hope has been exceptional. Like, he played 4 series this week and was the better AD carry in all 4. He has really emerged as like a top 3 AD carry in the LPL. The fact that that's even within the realm of a conversation is incredible, and you should give a lot of credit to AL for that, but give a lot of credit to Hope for kind of moving forward and continuing to evolve his game as this primary option on things like Jinx in game number 1. Really great stuff. Kale was excellent. Once again, just another support gap. Don't be surprised if you see his name in the player of the week hat. Spoiler alert for about 5 minutes from now, but Tarzan was great. Flandre was great on the top side, even with Breathe trying to step up and being the player on Weibo that I don't think was all that bad over the course of this week. Flandre was just better. AL are just clicking, man. Like, I've already gone over it a bunch. This team's really good. You know how good they are. And unfortunately for Weibo, this was not the week number 2 that they were looking for. They were also kind of jam-packed this week in terms of the amount of games that they played, and they did not look as good as their counterparts would. And I'm significantly more concerned about Weibo coming out of week 2 than I was going into it, which is not a great sign. Tion had already looked pretty bad throughout the beginning part of this week, but it was Hong that really just ran it, like no other way to say it, in this game, and especially in game number 2. Like, AL Hong was very much kind of a part of this. I don't know what curse it is when it comes to Weibo Gaming and their supports, but every single support that they sign has to run it, like, regularly on their team, regardless of who they are, and regardless of how consistent of a player they were before they got on Weibo Gaming. They're just instructing their supports to be so much more aggressive, and oftentimes it doesn't really lead to fantastic results. We saw it with Crisp for many years, even if he is still a very aggressive player, but Hong was kind of the pinnacle of stability in the support position in the LPL, as opposed to players like Crisp or On that can be a little bit more feast or famine. Hong was kind of the one you felt good about on a game-to-game basis, and now he comes over here to Weibo, and that's already all upended. He was awful in game number 2. Easiest possible choice for dead of the series that I could go for, but I do still want to say Tion continues to not be really all that effective. He was not good at all in week number 2. I think Xiaohu got completely outplayed here by Shanks, and as well as he started off in the spring split, I don't know if that's carried over so far to the back half. Light was only okay. He's starting to get a little bit antsy in terms of his positioning, and he's starting to step up more than he probably should. And Breathe has been good. Again, maybe he's getting caught a bit more than you would like, but he's also generating a good amount of resources for himself. It's all really just about what the rest of this team can do, and right now, that's nothing. Weibo Gaming feel kind of outclassed at this level, which is very, very scary. There is a real chance this is not like a top 6 team in the LPL, and if that's the case, that is a gigantic disappointment for them. But nice win for AL. You don't want to overreact too much to 1 week. Perhaps they can be able to get their bearings and move forward, but remember, no days off in the LPL, and so you just got to keep your head on a swivel. A lot of games to play in Group Ascend, and I think both of these teams have unfortunately established that they either need to keep their pace up or kind of turn that around. For now, that's a bad thing for Weibo and a good thing for AL. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LPL Spring Split Week number 2 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the updated standings after 2 weeks of action. Week 1 was more of a small formality. Week number 1, Week 2 is really where we got to dive into a lot of the action here. We still have a couple of teams down in Group Nirvana that have not played yet. The reason for that, especially in comparison to how many games have been played, how many series have been played in Group Ascend is, of course, Group Nirvana is single round robin, Group Ascend is double round robin, so they gotta fly through those Group Ascend series. They definitely want to focus more on the good teams than the bad teams, but still a lot to glean. We can see that in my personal power rankings, which you can see in the first column to the right of every team name. Change is going to be how they have changed from last week to this week. We can go over risers and fallers, but not as many changes as people might think. It wasn't that shocking of a week, all things considered. I think the first notable thing, Top Esports is going to stay at number 1 despite losing to Invictus. It really felt like that was an off series for them, and while I do think that there is still an argument to be made that number 1 is wide open in terms of expectations, especially with AL playing so well right now, I just can't justify taking Top Esports out of it. AL is going to jump up to number 2 pretty easily. Those are the top 2 teams in the league right now, especially after week number 2. LGD Gaming going to jump up to number 3. It feels like they are very clearly in that number 3 spot. They kind of solidified that, especially if Ala and Missing are going to play a lot better than they have at the beginning of the year. That's really going to solidify them. And then maybe controversially, IG is going to stay at 4. Some people might put them higher, some people might put them lower. There's such a feast or famine team, but it's hard for me to imagine that right now they're not on the borderline of top 4. They very much feel like the not old, but like last year and 2 years ago version of Weibo Gaming, where they can look great at any moment, they can look awful at any moment, but at the end of the day, they're going to make worlds. It kind of really does feel like that's kind of the pathway that they're on right now, and that means going in at number 5 for me, it's going to be Bilibili Gaming. We shot them up not only after the start of the Group Ascend phase, but after what we saw in the placement stage. It felt like this team was starting to figure its playstyle out. Throw that all out the window. They were awful this week, and honestly, they deserve to move down to number 5. Perhaps they might even be lower if they continue to play the way that they have, but this is as low as I can put them right now. I considered them at 4 and Invictus at 5. I think that would be reasonable as well, but honestly, Invictus was better than Bilibili this week, so the tiebreaker goes to them. Ninjas and Pyjamas will leapfrog Weibo Gaming, going up to number 6. Weibo falls to number 7. I don't feel great about NIP, but at the very least, they have a consistent playstyle that at least if they execute it, it can look look good. I don't think it's super easy to execute against the teams that are actually good, but Weibo just don't really have an identity right now, especially if Tion and Hong are going to underperform. No other changes. Perhaps people want FPX to move up and ThunderTalk to move down, but don't forget, ThunderTalk did beat FPX in week number 1. I don't feel confident enough to say that FPX is definitely better than ThunderTalk to move them above, and certainly no changes down in Group Nirvana. Everything kind of going as anticipated. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with, who's too high, who's too low. Always curious to know your thoughts and opinions on that stuff, but let's go ahead and move into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 2. Player of the week should be pretty obvious if you watch the video. It's Kale, the support for anyone's legend. AL was dominant this week, 4-0 in terms of the series that they had. Basically everything you could have asked for, and Kale was the biggest proponent for that, at least in my opinion. Hope definitely getting a rough run here because he's not getting any of the player of the series, but Kale I think definitely deserves the big shout. That Poppy game in particular in Game 1 versus Invictus, and that whole series against FPX was just gorgeous from him, especially after game number 1, so he's my player of the week. If you wanted to consider everyone else on AL, I think that that's fair as well, but my honorable mentions, just to try to shake some teams up, it's going to be Kanavi from Top Esports. People will remember that Invictus series, but the other 3 series he played this week were absolutely stellar, especially the first 2, more than deserving of an honorable mention. And then Ala, the top laner for JD Gaming. I do think he absolutely deserves to be in this honorable mention segment. He was the best player on JDG this week who really established themselves as the 3rd best team, at least in terms of the power rankings in the LPL. So Ala and Kanavi are my honorable mentions, and Kale is my player of the week. My dud of the week, unfortunately also kind of an easy choice, which we'll talk about. It's going to go to Hoya, the top laner for ThunderTalk. ThunderTalk feels pretty outclassed at this level when they're not facing FPX or WE, and that's kind of what we expected going into this, but the solo laners in particular really let this team down. There were other options, most notably Hong, the support for Weibo Gaming, that I really did consider in this area, but Hoya was so bad in the 2 series, and at least Weibo won a series this week. That kind of was the tipping point. Hoya is going to get my dud of the week, and Kale is going to get my player of the week, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be posting about the rest of the LPL, usually on Mondays going forward, and tomorrow's going to be a double upload for you LCK fans. I promise I'll be able to get the NACL and the LCK out tomorrow, so if you're interested in that, stick around. We go over every single region here. That includes the LTA North, the LEC, as well as the regions we already talked about, so if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all